And welcome! This is Asia, and here's Iraq. Now let's Iraq and roll, shall we? The tale of Iraq is an exceedingly ancient one, and its present-day borders encompass a sizable chunk of that miraculous region the Greeks called Mesopotamia, the green fertile land between the rivers Euphrates and Tigris. It was along the silt-rich banks of these life-giving waters that the very first civilizations in the world arose. The earliest full-fledged one was Sumer, which sprouted in the 5th millennium BC. The Sumerians are mostly a mystery, but one thing is certain, they were exceptionally clever. Making good use of the verdant ground beneath their feet by extensive agriculture, they went on to build big cities like Uruk and Ur, and invented both the wheel and writing. We call their script cuneiform. They would scratch their markings into wet clay with reed styluses, and then bake the tablets, leaving them with, well, a hard copy. The Sumerians spoke a language isolate, speech not related to other tongues, and with it they told tales of their gods and heroes like Gilgamesh, the super-strong part-god king of Uruk, who searched in vain for eternal life. They built enormous mud-brick step temples to their deities called ziggurats, and war was apparently quite common. Sumer ended up conquered by the Semitic-speaking Akkadians under Sargon of Akkad, whose life bridged the 24th and 23rd centuries BC. The Akkadians were so pleased with Sumerian culture that they adopted it wholesale, and the Akkadian Empire attained its peak under Naram-Sin, who very humbly referred to himself as a god. Akkadian dominance of Mesopotamia set the framework for the next two major civilizations of Iraq, one of which held sway over the north, Assyria, named after the city Ashur, and the other over the south, Babylonia, named after the city Babylon, as if you couldn't tell. Our attention will now switch from one to the other like heads watching a tennis match, as each takes a turn being in the ascendancy. We start with Assyria, which became a noteworthy kingdom after the early 2000s BC, enriched by trade. As it declined, power was augmenting down south, which had seen an influx of Amorites from the Levant. They turned the unassuming town of Babylon into something mighty, conquering a lot of clay with King Hammurabi in the 18th century BC, who defeated the Assyrians and became master of Mesopotamia. Hammurabi is most famed for his code of laws, one of which declared, if a builder built a house that collapsed, then the builder would be executed. As is usual with strong kings, they are typically followed by weaklings, and Babylon lost land and ended up sacked by the Hittites from the west, and then conquered by the Kassites from the east. Heading back north, we find Assyria recharged and more militant than it was before. To survive in ancient Mesopotamia, you had to be tough, and Assyria was frequently at war with its neighbors, and very often the aggressor, seeking land and resources, and boasting in inscriptions of how great they were. Be it so, Assyrian might slowly dwindled in the wake of the Bronze Age collapse, and new migratory arrivals of semi-nomadic Arameans and Chaldeans brought more changes, the simpler alphabet and language of Aramaic becoming the common tongue of the Middle East for centuries. Now let's head back to Babylonia. The Kassites who'd conquered it proved able administrators and took pains to re-glorify the old Sumerian city of Nippur, but they were constantly harassed by Assyria and ended up overrun by the Elamites in the 12th century BC. Back up north we find restless Assyria reawakened and ready to roar, and they certainly did that. The Neo-Assyrian Empire burst forth and conquered a formidable kingdom under impressive monarchs with impressive beards, leading updated, well-organized armies that saw Assyria become a superpower, feared by all surrounding nations. The Assyrians were not the people you wanted to mess around with, and rebels would commonly be impaled, burned, or skinned alive. Shalmaneser III called himself king of all peoples. Tiglath-Pileser III conquered Babylon. Sennacherib destroyed it and beautified the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. Esarhaddon rebuilt Babylon and conquered Egypt, and Ashurbanipal established a great library which has preserved for us many precious ancient texts. After him, Assyria, exhausted from centuries of battle, finally fell forever after its enemies joined forces and invaded. Back south now to Babylon, which under Nabopolassar was freed from the Assyrian yoke. He founded the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which reached its peak in power and prosperity under his famous successor, Nebuchadnezzar, who extended and adorned his capital with glittering temples and bulky walls and gates of glazed brick of brilliant blue, and tradition holds he constructed the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The glory of Babylon was but ephemeral, however, and after Nebuchadnezzar, it weakened and ended up like the rest of Iraq, conquered by the Persians under Cyrus the Great in the 500s BC. Greek rule followed after Alexander galloped onto the scene in the 300s BC, but then the forces of Iran returned in the 2nd century BC with the Parthians. Rome made several incursions into Iraq, and the 1st century saw the Assyrian people adopt the Christian faith. Iranian rule continued for centuries more under the Sassanid kings, and Persian culture permeated Iraq. The 7th century saw the Arabs invade and conquer the country and introduce Islam, which would become the land's majority religion, and Arabic replaced Aramaic as the common language. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, in the 8th century, the city of Baghdad was constructed and soon became a flourishing hub of knowledge and culture during what's called the Islamic Golden Age. Arab scholars worked along with Persians, Jews, and Christians to study and translate Eastern as well as Greek philosophy, science, and mathematics, and themselves made a number of advancements to enshrine in Baghdad's grand library the Bayt al-Hikmah. Al-Khwarazmi pondered algebraic calculations. Al-Kindi philosophized. Al-Mutanabbi penned his poems. Al-Tabari commentated on the Quran, and Ibn al-Haytham is known as the father of optics. Conversely, the penned his poems. Al-Tabari commentated on the Quran, and Ibn al-Haytham is known as the father of optics. Conversely, these gleaming endeavors occurred alongside the forced agricultural labor of African slaves called Zanj, who rose up in a bloody revolt in the latter 9th century. The power of the Abbasid caliphs diminished, and control shifted to the Seljuk Turks. 1258 would prove to be among the most unhappy years Iraq would ever know, for it saw the vicious Mongol invasion, whose forces mercilessly butchered the population of Baghdad. Mosques and shrines in the Great Library were burned, and it was said the Tigris River flowed black from ink. Devastated Iraq long languished amid the miseries of hunger, plague, and poverty, and as if they hadn't endured enough, the brutal hordes of the conqueror Timur dealt Baghdad a blow in 1401 that would have made the Mongols queasy. In short, 120 towers were made from the decapitated heads of Baghdad's citizens. Timur also took great delight in killing Christians, and almost single-handedly exterminated the Assyrian Church of the East. Iraq then became a battleground, fought over by the Safavid Persians and the Ottoman Turks, the Ottomans gaining the upper hand in the 17th century. But there wasn't a lot to rule over in melancholy Iraq, so the years passed dustily by, trade thankfully resumed, and manifold Arabians migrated into the region. Then, in the early 20th century, Iraq found itself entangled in World War I, due to being part of the Ottoman Empire, which had allied with Germany. The British invaded, defeated Ottoman forces, and took command in 1917. The mandate they established upset the independence-hungry Arabs, and both Sunni and Shia tribes arose in revolt, as did the Kurds up north, who wanted their own nation. The Kurds are an Iranian people, considered by some to be descended from the ancient Medes. Anyway, the British quenched both rebellions, but granted Iraq more autonomy, and Arabian Prince Faisal was installed as king in 1921. And though Iraq gained independence in 1932, Western influence persisted, and to free the country entirely from foreign sway was the goal of the 1958 revolution, which overthrew the monarchy. The new regime was then toppled in 1963 by the socialist nationalist Ba'ath Party. You might even say the regime had taken a Ba'ath. Boo! And under Ahmed Hussein al-Bikr, the country began doing pretty well. Oil sales proved very lucrative, and living standards improved. In 1979, the president stepped down and was replaced by Saddam Hussein, who had pretty much been running things anyway and played a big part in modernizing the country. And living standards improved. In 1979, the president stepped down and was replaced by Saddam Hussein, who had pretty much been running things anyway and played a big part in modernizing the country, and now swiftly acted to have his opponents executed. This was the same year as Iran's revolution, and while the two countries were already not on good terms, they were both majority Shia Muslim, and Saddam did not want his people espousing revolutionary sentiments that might threaten his position. This and other reasons led to the Iraqi invasion of Iran, but the Iranians were not exactly pushovers, and the hard-fought war ended with nothing gained but a lot of life lost, and Iraq was not exactly the most popular country on the bloc after it was accused of using chemical weapons against civilians such as the Kurds. The war left Iraq very much in debt and unable to repay the multiple billions it had borrowed from oil-rich Kuwait, and Kuwait hesitated to answer Iraq's appeals for economic forgiveness, and tensions escalated after Iraq accused Kuwait of pinching Iraqi oil by diagonal drilling, and it ended with Iraq invading Kuwait in August 1990 and quickly taking control. Saddam very likely had not anticipated the outrage his invasion would cause in the international community, but it did, yet he refused to withdraw. The United States subsequently led an enormous coalition of forces against Iraq in the Gulf War, the combat phase of which was called Operation Desert Storm, and Iraqi troops were kicked out of Kuwait, but made sure to set hundreds of oil wells on fire as they retreated. Yet something stung Iraq more than this defeat and the war-torn wreckage the country had become: the crippling UN sanctions that halted Iraq's oil exports and acted like a jackboot on the nation's neck. The UN wanted Iraq to disarm and to shut down its weapon facilities. Iraq's complaint complaint that its national sovereignty was being abused went unheeded. In 1995, an oil for food program was formed in which Iraq could sell its oil in exchange for humanitarian aid. In 2003, the US, believing that Saddam was secretly stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, invaded in March, taking Baghdad in April as the British occupied Basra. Saddam was captured in December and later executed by an Iraqi court. Now, as bad as things had been in Iraq, they only got worse. There were no weapons of mass destruction. Anti-American militias popped up. The terrorist organization of Al-Qaeda caused all sorts of havoc as the Americans were torturing and degrading prisoners. A most wretched, ugly, ignoble time. Estimates for the number of deaths caused by the Iraq War vary, some positing over 1 million Iraqis killed. US soldiers were withdrawn in 2011. The same year, Syria, next door, collapsed into civil war. A considerable measure of additional chaos hurtled into Iraq, notably the rise of terrorist mob ISIS, who menaced the country, committing genocidal massacres against the Shia, Christians, and Yazidis. After 2015, ISIS began to decline from the combined efforts of the Iraqi military, Kurdish fighters, and US airstrikes. Understandably, protests over the state of the country began springing up amid all the protracted bad conditions. So that's the sad story of Iraq so far, and one can only hope happier days await the land where civilization began, the land of Abraham, Babylon, and the Arabian Nights, as it works to recover and rebuild and repair the cracks and breaches that have for too long hindered the country's course to betterment. But as for me, it's bye for now. Bye-bye.
هەمووان لە یەک ڕیزدا نزا دەکەن بۆ ئاشتی و پێکەوەژیان و داهاتوویەکی باشتر بۆ باشووری کوردستان. لە هەولێر لە مزگەوتی ئاڵتون خوانێکی هاوبەش بۆ نوێنەری گشت پێکاتە و ئاینە جیاوازەکانی باشووری کوردستان ڕێککرا.
ئەمانە سەرجەمێن هاتوون تکاو نزا و پاڕانەوە دەکەن بۆ پاراستنی ئەم دەستکەوتانی لە هەرێمی کوردستان و هەموو هاتوون سەرجەم ئاینەکان و پێکاتەکان هاتوونە بەڵێن بدەن کە بەرەو ڕێفراندۆم بچین.
دوای ڕۆژ و شکاندن و نوێژی موسڵمانان نوێنەر و پیاوانی ئاینی هەشت ئاینی جیاواز لەسەر یەک مێزنانیان خوارد. ئەوانیش بریتی بوون لە نوێنەرانی ئاینی ئیسلام، مەسیحی، ئێزیدی، جووەکان، زەردەشتی، سابیعەی مەندائی، بەهائی، کاکەی و یارسانەکان. پەیامی هەمووانیش ئەوە بوو کە ئەو پێکەوە ژیانی لە باشووری کوردستان هەیە لە هیچ شوێنێکی ناوچەکە نەیان بینیوە.
هەرێمی کوردستان پێشەنگە لە پێکەوە ژیان. لە ڕاستیدا ئێمە ئاوارەی دەشتی نینەوەین. ئەو پێکەوە ژیانەی لە هەرێمی کوردستان بینیومانە لە هیچ شوێنێکی دیکە نەمان بینیوە.
ئەگەر بێتە سەیری کوردستان کەین، سەیری جوگرافیای کوردستان کەین، ئەگەر بێت سەیریکەن مزگەوتێک لە تەنیش مابەدێک لە تەنیش پەرستگایەک، شیعەیەک لە تەنیش سوننەیەک لە تەنیش زەردەشتیەک لە تەنیش بکەواتە ئەم تێکەڵاوی پێکەوە ژیانە کوردستانی جوانتر کردەوە.
لە دوای خوانەکە چالاکی ئاینەکان نمایش کرا. باشووری کوردستان نیشتیمانی چەندین نەتەوەی جیاواز و ژینگەی پەیڕەوانی چەندین ئاینی جیاوازە. ئەو نەتەوە و ئاینانەی دەیانەوێت بە هەموو جیهان بڵێن ئەوان لە باشووری کوردستان ئاشتی نێوان ئاین و مرۆڤەکان ناسنامەی سەرەکیانە.